In the frozen hell of Stalingrad, where death wore 1,000 faces, one soldier became a legend, whispered in fear by the enemy and reverenced by his comrades. They called him the Iron Wolf, a man who should have died 100 times but refused to fall. This is his story, and the story of those who fought beside him in humanity's darkest hour. The Iron Wolf. The winter of 1942 descended upon Stalingrad like an executioner's blade, transforming the once proud city into an apocalyptic landscape of shattered buildings, frozen corpses, and unrelenting violence. In this crucible of human suffering, where the temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, and every street corner became a potential grave, ordinary men were forged into legends, or broken into fragments of their former selves. Among the Soviet defenders holding the line against the seemingly unstoppable German Wehrmacht stood Senior Sergeant Dmitri Volkov, a man whose reputation had already begun to spread through the ranks like wildfire through dry timber. The soldiers called him Железный Волк, the Iron Wolf, though he himself never used the name. At 32 years old, with a face carved by hardship and eyes that had witnessed too much death, Volkov embodied the desperate resilience of a nation fighting for its very survival. The story of the Iron Wolf did not begin in the ruins of Stalingrad, but in the small village of Krasnoyarsk, where Volkov had worked as a schoolteacher before the war. He had been a gentleman then, fond of poetry and classical music, with a young wife named Anya and a daughter, Katya, who had just celebrated her 6th birthday when the Germans invaded in June 1941. Those memories seemed to belong to another lifetime, to another man who had died somewhere along the long, blood-soaked road from Moscow to the Volga. Volkov had watched his unit decimated in the desperate defense of Moscow, had seen friends and brothers in arms cut down by machine gun fire, consumed by flames, or simply disappear into the chaos of retreat. He had received word in the spring of 1942 that Krasnoyarsk had been overrun, that Anya and Katya were gone, swallowed by the vast darkness that the war had cast across the land. Something fundamental had broken inside him that day, but instead of shattering completely, he had hardened, transforming grief into an iron determination that would not bend or break. By the time his unit reached Stalingrad in September 1942, Volkov had become something more than human in the eyes of his comrades, a warrior who seemed immune to fear, who led charge after charge against entrenched German positions with a calculated ferocity that inspired those around him. He never asked his men to take risks he wouldn't take himself, and he possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it materialized, saving countless lives through instinct honed razor-sharp by months of constant combat. The battle for Stalingrad was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Two massive armies, each numbering in the hundreds of thousands, grappled in intimate, savage combat among the ruins of a city that had become more concept than place. Buildings that had stood for decades were reduced to skeletal frameworks overnight. The Volga River, frozen solid, became a highway for supply columns that crept across under constant artillery bombardment. The city itself was divided into a patchwork of territories, with Germans holding one floor of a building while Soviets defended the floor above or below, separated only by collapsed masonry and mutual hatred. Volkov's section held a position in the Barakati factory district, a hellish maze of destroyed machinery, collapsed walls, and hidden firing positions. The factory had once produced artillery pieces for the Red Army. Now it was itself the battleground, with both sides fighting room by room, machine by machine, in combat so close that soldiers could hear their enemies breathing in the darkness. It was here, in the frozen labyrinth of the Barakati factory, that the legend of the Iron Wolf would be written in blood and sacrifice.
The section under Volkov's command numbered 23 men, survivors of larger units that had been ground down by the relentless German assault. There was young Alexei, barely 19, who still dreamed of the girl he'd left behind in Leningrad. There was Boris, the grizzled veteran of the Finnish War, who could strip and reassemble a Mosin Nagant rifle blindfolded. There was Pyotr, the Ukrainian farm boy with a gift for scrounging supplies from seemingly nowhere. And there was Nikolai, Volkov's closest friend, a former engineer who approached combat with the same methodical precision he had once applied to building bridges. These men and the others in Volkov's section had learned to survive in conditions that would have broken most soldiers. They slept in shifts in the frozen rubble, never more than arm's reach from their weapons. They ate whatever they could find, often nothing more than a crust of bread in a handful of snow. They fought in temperatures that froze rifle bolts and turned human flesh brittle as glass. And they endured because Volkov endured, because the Iron Wolf refused to yield even when yielding seemed the only sane option. The German offensive of November 1942 sought to finally break the Soviet resistance and capture the remaining Soviet-held portions of the city. The Wehrmacht threw everything they had into the assault: crack infantry divisions, tanks that could barely maneuver through the rubble-choked streets, and constant aerial bombardment that turned day into a chaos of falling masonry and screaming metal. On November 11th, German forces launched a massive assault on the Barakati factory, determined to break through to the Volga and split the Soviet defenses. The attack began at dawn with an artillery barrage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Shells of every caliber rained down on the Soviet positions, transforming the already devastated factory into an even more nightmarish landscape of fire and shattered concrete.
Volkov moved through his positions as the barrage continued, checking on his men, offering words of encouragement, ensuring that weapons were clean and ammunition distributed. He had learned that leadership in combat was not about grand speeches or heroic gestures, but about the small acts that reminded men they were not alone, that someone was thinking about their survival, that their lives mattered to someone beyond the cold calculus of military necessity. When the barrage finally lifted, the German infantry came forward in waves, gray-coated figures moving through the smoke and dust like ghosts. Volkov waited until they were close, 50 meters, 40, 30, then gave the order to fire. The Soviet positions erupted with rifle fire, machine gun bursts, and the occasional crack of an anti-tank rifle. Germans fell, but more kept coming, their training and discipline driving them forward despite the casualties. The battle devolved into the savage close-quarters combat that characterized the struggle for Stalingrad. Germans made it into the Soviet positions, and fighting became hand-to-hand, with bayonets, knives, sharpened entrenching tools, and bare hands. Volkov was everywhere, his PPSH submachine gun barking short, controlled bursts, his movements economical and deadly efficient. He had long ago passed beyond fear into a state of hyper-awareness where time seemed to slow and every detail became crystal clear. The fighting raged for 6 hours without pause. Twice the Germans penetrated deep into the Soviet positions, and twice Volkov led counterattacks that drove them back. Young Alexei died during the second German push, cut down by a burst of machine gun fire while trying to reach a wounded comrade. Boris took shrapnel in the leg, but refused evacuation, continuing to fire his rifle from a sitting position until he passed out from blood loss. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the ruins, the German assault finally broke. The survivors retreated back to their lines, leaving behind dozens of bodies frozen in the postures of their final moments. Volkov's section had held, but at a terrible cost. Of the 23 men who had started the day, only 17 remained combat effective. The others were dead,
wounded, or missing. That night, as his exhausted men tried to find a few hours of rest, Volkov made his rounds through the position. He found Nikolai working on a damaged machine gun, his engineer's hands moving with practiced precision despite the cold.
"They'll come again tomorrow," Nikolai said without looking up. It was not a question. "Yes," Volkov replied simply. "How much longer can we hold?" Volkov was silent for a long moment, staring out at the German lines barely 100 meters distant. "As long as we must," he finally said. "The moment we stop believing we can hold is the moment we're already defeated." Nikolai nodded, understanding the deeper truth in those words. The battle for Stalingrad was not just about territory or strategic objectives. It had become a test of wills, a contest to determine which side could endure more suffering, more privation, more death. The Soviets were fighting for their homeland, for their families, for the very existence of their nation. They could not afford to lose. The pattern established on November 11th repeated over the following days: German attacks, Soviet defenses, casualties mounting on both sides. The Barricadi factory changed hands multiple times, with portions of the complex falling to German assault, only to be retaken hours later in desperate Soviet counterattacks. The line between the two armies became increasingly blurred, with small groups of soldiers from both sides occupying positions mere meters apart, hurling grenades and insults at each other in the darkness. It was during this period that Volkov's reputation spread beyond his immediate unit. Stories began to circulate of the Soviet sergeant who seemed impossible to kill, who appeared at crisis points as if summoned by the need itself, who fought with a cold, controlled fury that inspired his men and unnerved the enemy. German officers began to hear reports from their soldiers of a Soviet leader who wore the pelt of a wolf over his shoulders and whose eyes glowed in the darkness. Embellishments born of fear and exhaustion, but containing a kernel of truth about the formidable warrior who opposed them. The reality was less supernatural, but no less remarkable. Volkov had survived because he was smart, careful, and utterly committed to keeping his men alive. He had learned to read the battlefield the way a sailor reads the sea, sensing danger and opportunity through small signs invisible to less experienced soldiers. He rotated his men to ensure no one stayed in the most exposed positions too long. He personally checked every defensive position, looking for fields of fire, escape routes, and structural weaknesses that could turn a strongpoint into a death trap. He scrounged extra ammunition, food, and medical supplies through a network of contacts that spanned the entire Stalingrad front.
But beneath the tactical brilliance and the iron discipline, Volkov carried a weight that threatened to crush him. Every casualty was a personal failure, every loss a reminder of Anya and Katya. He drove himself mercilessly, sleeping only when absolutely necessary, eating even less than his already meager rations, pushing his body and mind to their absolute limits. Nikolai worried about him, could see the toll the constant stress was taking, but knew better than to voice his concerns. The Iron Wolf could not afford to show weakness, could not let his men see the grief and exhaustion that haunted him. As November gave way to December, the character of the battle began to shift. The German offensive had stalled, exhausted by the ferocious Soviet resistance and the impossible conditions. Both armies were worn down to shadows of their former strength, but the Germans had bled themselves white in their failed attempt to capture the city. Unknown to the soldiers freezing in the Barricadi factory, larger forces were in motion. The Soviet High Command had been quietly building up reserves outside the city, preparing for a massive counter-offensive that would trap the entire German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. Operation Uranus launched on November 19, 1942, with Soviet forces striking north and south of Stalingrad, cutting through the weaker Romanian and Italian armies protecting the German flanks. Within days, the encirclement was complete. The hunters had become the hunted,
and nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped in a pocket that was slowly but inexorably shrinking. The news filtered down to Volkov's section over the course of several days, brought by political officers and understood through the changed character of German attacks. The enemy was now fighting not to advance, but to survive, to break out of the trap or at least hold on until relief arrived. The desperation made them more dangerous in some ways, but it also meant that the end was in sight.
"We've won," Pyotr said one evening, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "Haven't we? I mean, they're trapped. It's just a matter of time now." Volkov, cleaning his weapon by the light of a small fire, shook his head slowly. "A trapped animal is most dangerous," he replied. "They'll fight harder now because they have nothing to lose. We haven't won until the last German has surrendered or is dead. Until then, we fight." His words proved prophetic. The trapped German forces fought with increasing desperation as December wore on, and it became clear that no relief was coming. Hitler had forbidden retreat, ordering the Sixth Army to hold Stalingrad at all costs. The result was a slow-motion catastrophe, with German soldiers dying by the thousands from combat, cold, starvation, and disease. But trapped as they were, the Germans remained formidable opponents. On December 23rd, as Soviet forces continued to compress the pocket, German units launched a series of counterattacks aimed at consolidating their perimeter and buying time. One of these attacks fell directly on Volkov's section of the line. The attack came at night, which was unusual but tactically sound. German stormtroopers infiltrated close to the Soviet positions under cover of darkness, using the ruins and frozen debris for concealment. The first warning Volkov had was a grenade exploding in a forward position, followed by the distinctive sound of German MP-40 submachine guns. "To arms!" he roared, grabbing his own weapon and moving toward the sound of fighting. Around him, his section came alive, men stumbling from sleep to combat readiness with the practiced speed born of months of such awakenings. The German attack was well planned and viciously executed. They had achieved tactical surprise and were already inside the Soviet positions, fighting room to room through the factory ruins. Volkov organized a hasty defense, positioning his men to create overlapping fields of fire, while he led a small team to counterattack the German penetration.
The fighting was savage, even by Stalingrad standards. In the close confines of the ruined factory, combatants were often close enough to see each other's faces in the muzzle flashes. Volkov moved through the chaos with lethal grace, his submachine gun barking short bursts, his movements fluid and purposeful. He killed a German officer in hand-to-hand combat, wrestled a machine gunner for his weapon, and dragged a wounded Pyotr to safety while under direct fire. The battle raged for 3 hours before the Germans finally withdrew, having taken heavy casualties and failed to achieve their objectives. But the cost to Volkov's section had been severe. 8 men were dead or missing, including Nikolai, who had been killed by a sniper while trying to reach an isolated group of Soviet soldiers. Another 5 were wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. Volkov found his friend's body at dawn, half buried in snow and rubble. Nikolai's face was peaceful, almost serene, and for a moment Volkov could imagine that he was merely sleeping. He knelt beside the body, this man who had been his closest companion through months of hell, and felt something inside him finally break. For the first time since receiving word of his family's death, Dmitri Volkov wept. He wept for Nikolai, for young Alexei and all the others who had fallen under his command. He wept for Anya and Katya, for the life he had lost and could never reclaim. He wept for himself, for the man he had been before the war and could never be again. He wept until he had no more tears, until he was empty of everything except a cold, crystalline clarity.
When he finally stood, brushing the snow from his knees, he was changed. The iron that had sustained him had been tempered in this final forge of grief, and what emerged was harder, sharper, more dangerous. The Iron Wolf had been a nickname, a legend born of exaggeration and desperate hope. Now it was a reality, a transformation complete. The remaining men of his section watched their sergeant with a mixture of awe and concern. They could see the change in him, could sense that something fundamental had shifted. When Volkov spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. "We've lost too many good men," he said, looking at each of the survivors in turn. "Nikolai, Alexei, Boris. All of them died holding this position, died to buy time for the motherland to strike back. We will not dishonor their sacrifice. We will hold this line until ordered otherwise or until every last one of us is dead. The Germans will not pass." The men nodded, understanding that this was not bravado or empty rhetoric. This was a promise, a covenant sealed in blood and grief. They would hold because the alternative, surrender, retreat, defeat, was unthinkable. They would hold because their comrades' deaths demanded meaning. They would hold because the Iron Wolf willed it, and his will had become their own. The final month of the battle passed in a haze of combat, cold, and exhaustion. The German pocket continued to shrink as Soviet forces pressed in from all sides. Conditions for the trapped Germans became increasingly desperate. They were starving, freezing, dying of typhus and dysentery. Their ammunition was running low, their medical supplies exhausted. Yet still they fought, because Hitler demanded it, and because surrender meant captivity in Soviet hands, a fate that terrified them almost as much as death. Volkov's section, now reinforced with replacements who looked impossibly young and terrified, continued to hold their section of the line. They repelled 2 more major German attacks, conducted several raids into German-held territory to capture supplies and prisoners, and maintained a constant pressure that denied the enemy any respite. On January 26, 1943, Soviet forces finally broke through to the Volga along a front that split the German pocket in two. The end was now inevitable. On January 31st, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the southern pocket. On February 2nd, the northern pocket capitulated. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The cost had been staggering. Nearly 2 million soldiers and civilians had died in the fighting. The city itself had been almost completely destroyed, reduced to a landscape of ruins that would take decades to rebuild. But the Soviet Union had won, had demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, that Nazi Germany could be defeated.
For Dmitri Volkov and his surviving men, the victory felt hollow. They had endured 6 months of the most brutal combat in human history. They had lost friends, comrades, brothers in arms. They had seen and done things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The liberation of Stalingrad was not a cause for celebration, but for somber reflection on the terrible price that had been paid. In the weeks following the German surrender, Volkov's section was finally pulled from the line for rest and refit. They were billeted in a relatively intact building on the outskirts of the ruined city, given hot food, clean uniforms, and the luxury of uninterrupted sleep. Volkov found himself unable to adjust to the relative peace. He would wake in the night, reaching for weapons that were no longer within arm's reach, listening for sounds of German movement that no longer threatened. It was during this period that he received a visit from a colonel from Stavka, the Soviet High Command. The officer, who introduced himself as Colonel Petrov,
had come to personally deliver Volkov's latest decoration, the Order of Lenin, and to make a proposition. "Senior Sergeant Volkov," Petrov began, settling into a chair across from the exhausted soldier. "Your record speaks for itself. 6 months of continuous combat in Stalingrad, holding a critical position against overwhelming odds, personally accounting for 47 confirmed enemy kills, inspiring your men through the darkest bays of the battle. The motherland recognizes your service." Volkov accepted the medal without comment, his face expressionless. Petrov continued, "You have a choice to make. You can accept a discharge, go home. Your service has been exemplary, and no one would question your decision to leave the army. Or," he paused, letting the word hang in the air, "you can continue to serve. We need men like you, Senior Sergeant. The war is far from over. We've stopped the Germans at Stalingrad, but now we must drive them back, liberate our territory, and eventually carry the fight into Germany itself. We need leaders who know how to win, who won't break no matter what the enemy throws at them." Volkov was quiet for a long time, staring at the medal in his hands. Go home. But where was home? Krasnoyarsk was ashes and memories. Anya and Katya were gone. The man he had been before the war, the school teacher who loved poetry, that man was dead, had died somewhere in the ruins of Stalingrad, along with Nikolai and Alexei and all the others. "I'll continue," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I'll continue until it's over, until we've driven every last German from Soviet soil and made them pay." Petrov nodded, satisfied. "I expected no less. You'll receive a promotion to lieutenant and command of a rifle company. We're forming new units with veterans of Stalingrad as the core, men who've proven they can hold under the worst conditions. You'll train the replacements, turn them into soldiers who can fight like you and your section fought."
And so the Iron Wolf's war continued. Through the spring and summer of 1943, Volkov trained his new company, instilling in them the hard lessons learned in Stalingrad, the importance of fire discipline, of maintaining defensive positions, of looking out for one another. He was a demanding officer, intolerant of incompetence or cowardice, but his men respected him because he never asked them to take risks he wouldn't take himself. In July 1943, Volkov's company participated in the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. His infantry supported Soviet armor as they broke the back of the German offensive, then transitioned to the pursuit as the Wehrmacht began its long retreat westward. Through Kharkov, through Ukraine, through Belarus, Volkov and his men fought their way westward, liberating Soviet territory village by village, town by town. The character of the war had changed. The desperate defensive battles of 1941, 1942 had given way to vast offensive operations that rolled over the German lines with crushing force. The Red Army was no longer the disorganized force that had nearly collapsed in the opening months of the war. It had been reforged in the crucible of combat, had learned from its mistakes, and now possessed an edge in men, materiel, and morale that the Germans could not match. But the Germans remained formidable opponents who extracted a heavy price for every kilometer of ground they surrendered. The fighting through 1943 and 1944 was characterized by a series of massive battles: Kursk, the battle for the Dnieper, the liberation of Crimea, Operation Bagration, that ground down both armies, but favored the Soviets with their superior numbers and industrial capacity. Volkov participated in all of these campaigns, his reputation growing with each battle.
The legend of the Iron Wolf spread throughout the Red Army, whispered by soldiers who had never met him but knew someone who had fought alongside him. Stories were told of his tactical brilliance, his courage under fire, his seemingly supernatural ability to sense danger and opportunity. Some of the stories were true. Others were embellishments born of distance and the human need for heroes in dark times. The reality was more complex and more human. Volkov was an exceptional soldier and leader, but he was not superhuman. He was wounded 3 times during the advance west, once seriously enough to require 2 weeks in a field hospital. He made mistakes that cost lives, decisions that haunted him in the small hours of the morning. He dealt with incompetent superiors, inadequate supplies, and the constant friction of military bureaucracy. But through it all, he maintained the iron will that had seen him through Stalingrad. He protected his men to the best of his ability, fought smart rather than heroically when possible, and never forgot the lessons learned in the frozen ruins of that city by the Volga. Each village liberated, each German unit defeated, brought the war one step closer to its conclusion. And that was all that mattered. By early 1945, the Red Army stood on the borders of Germany itself, poised to carry the war into the heart of the Third Reich. Volkov, now a captain commanding a battalion, led his men across the Oder River in February and participated in the final assault on Berlin in April and May.
The Battle of Berlin was apocalyptic, a fitting end to the most destructive war in human history. The city became a fortress, with German soldiers, SS troops, and even Hitler Youth fighting from block to block, building to building. The Soviets advanced methodically, using overwhelming firepower to blast through defenses before sending in infantry to clear the rubble. Volkov's battalion fought its way through the suburbs and into the city center, moving toward the Reichstag and the government quarter. The fighting was intense, but different from Stalingrad in one crucial respect. Everyone knew the war was nearly over, that German defeat was inevitable. The Germans fought with the desperation of the doomed, while the Soviets pushed forward with the knowledge that victory was within reach. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered. On May 8th, Germany signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender. The war in Europe was over. Volkov stood in the ruins of Berlin, looking at the shattered city that had been the heart of the Nazi Empire, and felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, only a vast emptiness. The war he had fought for nearly 4 years was over, but the battles he had won felt hollow. Anya and Katya were still dead. Nikolai and Alexei and all the others were still gone. The Soviet Union had survived and triumphed, but at a cost that defied comprehension. More than 27 million dead, whole cities destroyed, an entire generation scarred by trauma. In the days following the German surrender, Volkov walked through the Soviet-occupied sectors of Berlin, observing the aftermath of total war. German civilians picked through the rubble, searching for food, water, anything salvageable. Soviet soldiers celebrated their victory, but the celebrations had a forced quality, as if everyone was too exhausted to properly appreciate what they had accomplished. He encountered a group of German children near the ruins of the zoo station, hollow-eyed and frightened, watching the Soviet soldiers warily. They reminded him achingly of Katya, of the childhood that war had stolen from an entire generation. On impulse, he approached them, offering chocolate from his rations. They took it hesitantly,
still not entirely certain whether he was a threat or a savior. "The war is over," he told them in broken German, even though he doubted they understood. "No more bombs, no more fighting." One of the children, a girl who couldn't have been more than 7, looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. "My papa is dead," she said in German. "The bombs killed him." Volkov nodded slowly, understanding her words, if not her language. "My family too," he replied in Russian. "War takes from all of us." It was a small moment, insignificant in the vast sweep of history, but it stayed with Volkov for the rest of his life. The war had taken so much from so many, had destroyed families and futures on both sides of the conflict. The Germans had started it, had brought death and destruction to the Soviet Union, but in the end, everyone had lost. There were no real victors in such a war, only survivors. In the months following Germany's surrender, Volkov remained in Berlin with the occupation forces. He was offered a position with the military administration, a comfortable posting that would have allowed him to remain in the army without the dangers of combat. He declined. The army had been his life for 4 years, but that life no longer held meaning for him. In August 1945, Volkov received his discharge papers. He was 35 years old, a decorated war hero with the Order of Lenin, 2 Orders of the Red Banner, and numerous other medals. He had survived 6 major battles, been wounded 4 times, and led his men through some of the most brutal combat in human history. The Iron Wolf had become a legend, a symbol of Soviet determination and courage. But Dmitri Volkov didn't feel like a hero or a legend. He felt tired, worn down to his core, ancient beyond his years. The war had taken everything from him: his family, his friends, the person he had been before the invasion. What remained was a shell, a man haunted by memories of the dead and ghosts of battles past. He returned to the Soviet Union in September 1945, traveling by train through the devastated landscape of Eastern Europe. Everywhere he looked, he saw the scars of war: bombed cities, burned villages, displaced populations trudging along roads with their possessions piled on carts or carried on their backs. The victory had been complete, but the cost would take decades to overcome. Volkov considered returning to Krasnoyarsk, but quickly dismissed the idea. There was nothing there for him anymore, only painful memories. Instead, he settled in Moscow, taking a position as an instructor at a military academy. He could at least pass on his knowledge to the next generation, teach young officers the lessons he had learned in blood and suffering. The years passed. Stalin died in 1953, and the Soviet Union slowly emerged from the paranoia and brutality of his rule. The country rebuilt, channeling resources into reconstruction and, eventually, into competition with the West that would define the Cold War era. Veterans of the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called World War II, received pensions and honors, though the memories of the war remained painful. Volkov taught at the academy for 20 years, molding young officers with the same demanding standards he had applied to his own men during the war. He never spoke of Stalingrad unless directly asked, and even then, his accounts were clinical, devoid of emotion. The legend of the Iron Wolf faded as the war receded into history, remembered by those who had served with him, but largely unknown to the younger generations. He never remarried, never had children. The wound left by Anya and Katya's deaths had never healed, and he could not imagine opening himself to that kind of pain again. Instead, he lived a solitary existence, reading voraciously, walking the streets of Moscow,
and occasionally meeting with other veterans to share a drink and remember those who hadn't made it home. In his later years, as the Soviet Union began to fracture and eventually collapse, Volkov became something of a living relic, one of the last survivors of Stalingrad. Journalists would occasionally seek him out for interviews, asking him to recount his experiences for a new generation that had never known war. He granted these interviews reluctantly, uncomfortable with the attention and the mythologizing of what had been, for him, simply a matter of survival and duty. "They call me a hero," he told one interviewer in 1990, his voice heavy with irony. "But I was not a hero. I was simply a man who survived when better men died. The real heroes are buried in Stalingrad, in Kursk, in Berlin, in 1,000 unmarked graves across Europe. I'm just a man who lived." Dmitri Volkov died in 1995. At the age of 85, he passed away quietly in his sleep in his small apartment in Moscow, surrounded by books and memories. The few people who attended his funeral were fellow veterans, old men like himself, who remembered the war and what it cost. He was buried with military honors in a cemetery on the outskirts of Moscow. His headstone was simple, bearing only his name, his dates, and his rank. There was no mention of the Iron Wolf, no listing of his decorations or achievements. He would have approved of the simplicity. The Forgotten Heroes. The story of Dmitri Volkov, the Iron Wolf, is ultimately a story of all those who fought in World War II, particularly on the Eastern Front, where the war reached its most savage and destructive extremes. For every Volkov whose name has been remembered, there were millions of others whose sacrifices have been forgotten or never known.
The Soviet Union lost more than 27 million people during the Great Patriotic War. Soldiers, civilians, men, women, and children. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities like Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Minsk were reduced to ruins. The western regions of the country became a vast killing field where partisan warfare claimed countless lives. These losses are difficult for Western audiences to truly comprehend. The United States lost approximately 400,000 military personnel during World War II, a staggering number that represented an entire generation. But the Soviet Union's losses dwarfed even this, representing nearly 15% of its entire pre-war population. In some regions, the losses were even higher, with entire age cohorts virtually wiped out. The soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front faced conditions that were almost unimaginably harsh. The weather itself was a deadly enemy, with winter temperatures that could kill an unprotected soldier in minutes. Supply lines were tenuous, with soldiers often going days without proper food or adequate ammunition. Medical care was primitive by modern standards, and even minor wounds could prove fatal due to infection or exposure. Yet, despite these hardships, Soviet soldiers like Volkov fought on, motivated by a complex mixture of patriotism, ideology, fear of German occupation, and simple determination to protect their homeland. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was explicitly framed as a war of annihilation, with whole populations marked for death or enslavement. Soviet soldiers and civilians alike understood that defeat meant not just military conquest, but potential extinction. The Battle of Stalingrad, where Volkov earned his reputation, exemplified the savagery of the Eastern Front. The fighting lasted more than 6 months and resulted in nearly 2 million casualties. The city itself became a symbol of Soviet resistance, and its successful defense marked a turning point in the war. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht never recovered its offensive capability, and the eventual Soviet victory became increasingly inevitable. But Stalingrad was just one battle among many on the Eastern Front. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days and resulted in over 1 million civilian deaths, most from starvation. The Battle of Kursk involved more than 6,000 tanks and was the largest armored battle in history. Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that liberated Belarus in 1944, resulted in the destruction of the German Army Group Center and opened the path to Berlin. Throughout all these battles, soldiers like Volkov led their men, made impossible decisions, and carried the weight of command in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. They were not all heroes in the conventional sense. Many made mistakes, some committed war crimes, and the Soviet system itself was often brutally indifferent to individual lives. But they were human beings facing inhuman challenges, trying to survive and help their comrades survive in the face of unimaginable horror. Their stories resist neat moral frames. Bravery and brutality, sacrifice and cruelty, endurance and exhaustion were braided together in every unit, every village, every ruined street. Remembering them means holding those contradictions, honoring courage without sentimentalizing war, naming loss without simplifying causes, and listening to testimonies that are as messy and painful as the events they record. Dmitri Volkov, the Iron Wolf, was one thread in a vast, frayed tapestry. His life after the war, quiet and solitary, was as telling as his deeds in battle. Victory did not heal the wounds it inflicted. The true memorial to men like him is not merely a list of medals or a parade, but the slow work of memory, telling and retelling stories, preserving names, and confronting the full cost of violence so that future generations might understand why such wars must be prevented. History keeps its lessons in the voices of those who survived, and in the silence where the dead once spoke. If this tale of the Iron Wolf does anything, may it remind us that behind every strategic turning point and every headline are human lives, ordinary, complicated, and irreplaceable, and that remembering them is a responsibility that falls to all who live after.